agus Alaskan Cordia agus Guim Guach Weekus done on the Mekon an Ara O'Rourke on Chacta O'Rourke Mariaul on Billa Ata Oscorna Dala Nish agus Mariaul on over Ufos of Tavok Shuk occur Fivrod Nadala. The taxi driver sector, Minister, has suffered chronic neglect and abandonment over the last number of years. It has been forgotten about, mistreated. It has been failed by elected representatives. And there's no justification, in my view, or explanation for that government failure with regards to a sector that's so important to society and so important to the economy as well. And it's not just the taxi sector, to be honest, where the government shows aversion to helping. There's a number of sectors. If you look at childcare sectors, the pub trade getting the blame for much of COVID, trainee nurses throughout the pandemic. And it leads me to ask a number of questions. Are there sectors in Irish society that have great influence with the powers that be, maybe even great influence with the media? And are there other sectors in Irish society, because of maybe income, because of class, I don't know, whatever, but don't seem to have the necessary influence, the necessary pull, the necessary ability to communicate and have their voices heard with the government? And I think that is very, very dangerous, because if you ignore a sector of Irish society that is suffering massively, if you completely forget about them, you'll guarantee that that issue will fester and become more difficult to deal with in the long run. And indeed, it is the government's inaction that led to the massive strike that was held and the protest that was held yesterday. The government's inaction caused what happened yesterday. So we had thousands of drivers which took to the streets yesterday, and the reason they did so, because there is a sector of 22,000 jobs at stake here. And each of those 22,000 jobs has a family, has children, has a household behind them. And those incomes are so devastated that these individual taxi drivers were forced to take to the streets yesterday. And there's been incredible levels of unity within that sector. We've seen the National Private Hire and Taxi Association, the Irish Taxi Drivers Federation, the Taxi Alliance of Ireland and Tamani Taxi Nahéireann out yesterday. And when you see that level of unity, that sense of purpose amongst taxi drivers, you know well that they mean business with regards this. So, since the outbreak of the COVID-19, demand for the taxi services in this state have collapsed, dropping almost 70%. That's a devastating reduction within any market, and a devastating reduction in incomes as well. Now, several taxi drivers that I spoke to said that they have been barely able to afford to keep their vehicle on the road, never mind actually to take in an income necessary to deal with their families. Just if it's possible, just if people of particular families can have their conversations outside the chamber.
No, thank you very much. Deputies, please, we're interrupting the speaker. Yeah. Thanks.
Now, nearly 1 in 4 taxi drivers currently are over the age of 66, Minister, and these are being denied income support from the state because they're told that they're over the age of that, and that's incredibly wrong. Anybody whose income has been reduced by such a level should have a situation where they have the state to be able to help them. There shouldn't be discrimination between different sectors with regards income falling. So what were the taxi drivers? What were the thousands of taxi drivers protesting for? Now, when I spoke to them directly, I have to say, I was absolutely...
sorry, I really have to ask you to stop, please.
It's incredible. Is it possible, just there's a door outside, just to have
Deputy, if you could do it through the chair, thanks. I'm apologising. Please, can I have your cooperation, please? Thanks. Continue on, Deputy. Alaskan Cordia, I have great respect for the TDs that are making the noise at the moment. Use your time. But telephones are going off in this chamber on a regular basis. And conversations such as this, it does cause difficulty when people are trying to focus on representing the taxi sector here. I agree with you.
Now, I was surprised by how reasonable the demands of the taxi sector were. I think the taxi drivers themselves know that the state is in chaos at the moment, that they know that there is massive difficulties being experienced by society in general. Their asks are not unreasonable whatsoever. The central demand of taxi drivers is that they receive financial support package from the government. Now, that is a completely reasonable response to a sector that has lost massive income. Taxi drivers have seen that income depleted significantly, and drivers have had to fork out massively as well themselves on hand sanitizers, on perspex and plexiglass dividers to ensure that they can work in a safe manner, to ensure that their passengers are kept safe, and to ensure that they meet government guidelines as well. But they have had no support from the government in relation to that. And if the government continues to ignore taxi drivers, then I believe the government will be responsible not just for strikes, but actually in the loss of thousands of jobs in this state. And there's a fundamental issue here with regards to representation. And I always believe, whatever sector it is, make sure they have a voice and make sure that they are listened to. But quite simply, the Taxi Advisory Committee is not fit for purpose, Minister. It is not a representative body of taxi drivers' needs in this country. One taxi driver who sat on the committee for 2 years said to me that literally every time that their needs and their voices is made on that particular forum, that they were silenced or outvoted. So when grassroots organisations are silenced or disempowered, bet your bottom dollar, Minister, you will have a crisis on your hands. There needs to be a fit-for-purpose transport forum, representative of unions and workers throughout the transport sector in this country. We've seen bus drivers having to take to the streets. We've seen Lewis drivers and train drivers have to take to the streets. And now it's the turn of the taxi drivers. Any government worth their salt should have a radar open to see which sectors are in trouble, which sectors have to be listened to, have to be fixed before it comes to the breaking point of people taking to the streets. I just wanted to mention one other issue as well. I think yesterday's crisis in the Dáil is a phenomenal comparator to what's happening in the taxi sector. So the taxi sector are basically told, listen, get on with it yourselves, sort it out yourselves, take to the streets to get your voices heard, or just keep driving, even though they made themselves be in difficulty. And yet we had the cosseted political class yesterday literally close everything down. Well known that their incomes are not going to be touched in any ways. We had, a decision made to close the chamber down. Well, no discussion between the political parties. The first I heard about it was when RTE's correspondent Alan Kelly made a tweet on the television yesterday. And it's not a logical situation that the Dáil can be so cosseted, while at the same time 22,000 jobs in the taxi sector are under such pressure. So I would ask the government to make sure that they get out of the tunnel vision that they're in. We do have to make sure that we reduce COVID. We do have to make sure that we take precautions, that we're careful and that we're cautious. But people have to live with this particular illness as well. And we have to make sure that the health service and different sectors can function. And the fact that the taxi service are being left to swing in the wind in this time shows amazing tunnel vision by this government at the moment. And just the several key questions that I want to raise before I finish my contribution here. Why did the government not recognise the particular vulnerability of the taxi industry to the pandemic and COVID-19 guidelines at the start and do more? Why was it that the governments have shown such an aversion to help struggling sectors directly impacted by COVID-19, the lockdown and the continued government regulations, such as the pub trade, the childcare sector and the taxi industry? And why does the government consistently let the suffering go on to such a level that people are forced to strike outside Leinster House? Cámid I wadnís far a dhéanamh, mar gheall na airnáil atá timpeall na tíre atá ag phulint, mar gheall an galar seo agus mar gheall an aspa sim atá ag an rialtas seo, agus ag bhun an cairn sa tír seo I mothuirmse, tá na airnáil leis na income is lú, agus níl an tionchar nó ba ceart go mbeadh ag na airnáil sin. Ní lisagam an bhfuil discrimination no class de bhór an aspa díreach isteach na airnáil sin nó cad. Ach muna bhfuil an rialtas sásta cabhrú leis an airnáil taxi seo. by an realtas cruhu I wadni smo fibena socialta, fibena marjauler na taili hartimpel na tirisha, agus fib ulwar umper, mar cahi gomech an chorus sha aun sa tudki, nurta an tir egirie amach an sha, Gurmil Margaret.